Hello everyone, welcome to the Tour Guide Service Skills class. Today, what we have learned is the guide explanation of the garden landscape. Chinese gardens have a clever and delicate structure and profound connotations. To introduce the characteristics of Chinese gardens and the poetics and pictorial splendor vividly to tourists, and enable them to appreciate the charm of the landscape and experience the aesthetic feeling of the landscape. Tour guides must understand the art of Chinese garden architecture and master certain tour guide skills. Reasonably design the spatial sequence of the tour. Garden landscape is a kind of spatial art, stressing the overall layout. Therefore, there are many particularities in the processing of the garden visiting space procedure, from the conception, layout, rock piling, and so on, which are all set up to allow tourists to participate in the creation of aesthetic appreciation and obtain aesthetic enjoyment. Guiding the garden scenery requires to be flexible and vivid. The Chinese garden is a complex and hierarchical touring space. From the entrance of the garden gate, the scenery is placed according to its designed intention, allowing tourists to tour in a flowing spatial sequence where dynamic viewing and static appreciation alternate, with contrast changes between contraction and expansion, virtue and real, light and dark, so as to achieve the expected artistic effect. For example, in order to expand the visitor's perception of the limited garden space, Chinese gardens often set up some tortuous, restrained, and narrow space zones with dim lighting before the visitors see the main scenic area. This kind of contrast effect makes people feel that the main scenic area in front of them is very broad and has a sense of suddenly becoming enlightened. If the garden tour does not follow the designed route and directly enters the main scenic area, this kind of artistic effect of designing to promote by suppressing and promoting more after suppressing will be lost. In addition, if the route of the garden tour is taken in the opposite direction, the landscape seen along the way will also be different, and some landscapes may even not be seen. Introduce the garden from the perspective of landscape construction techniques. In order to let tourists have a more comprehensive understanding of the uniqueness and ingenuity of Chinese gardens in the art of landscape construction during the tour, facing the mutual complementarity between the sceneries, it is quite necessary to introduce the landscape construction methods of the garden to the visitors. The landscape construction techniques in Asian China mainly include borrowed scenery, oppositive scenery, leaking through scenery, obstructive scenery, frame view, vista line, and so on. Let's now look at how the tour guides use the immediate scenery during leading the tourists to visit the humble administrator's garden, and explain to the tourists one of the landscape construction methods, namely the frame view. If you walk into the front of the Lotus Pavilion and look into the west, you can see that on the frame of the entrance of this waterside pavilion, a carved round-lined cover is installed. Through this round-lined cover, you can see the small bridge and the flowing water ahead, just like a painting embedded in the circular frame of an oil painting. If you walk over and take a closer look, you can find that on the doors and windows of the waterside pavilion, adjacent to the water, a carved rectangular screen is installed. The front river water meander tortuously, and both sides of the bank are peach red and willow green, which leads people into a realm of peaceful and quiet, simple and natural. This is a relatively common landscape construction technique in Suzhou gardens called frame view. The garden owner wanted to use this technique to focus the guest's line of sight to the optimal angle in order to achieve a satisfying viewing effect. Explain the aesthetic appeal in the combination of motion and stillness. The tour guides need to guide the tourists in a combination of motion and stillness and fully feel the aesthetic appeal of the garden art. The so-called stillness. It requires the tour guides to give a detailed explanation on the important landscape elements of the garden architecture and organize the tourists to quietly appreciate and carefully savor the so-called motion. It then requires the tour guides to change views as they move, leading the tourists to visit in sequence, explaining while watching. Moving to change views is not simply a sequential and progressive touring sequence, but more importantly, it is to produce the feeling of changing views as one move. What it emphasizes is the composition method of initiation, continuation, transition, and conclusion in the tour explanation. Just like music or drama, there are the start, development, peak, and conclusion. In the process of touring guiding, there must be rhythm, both motion and stillness, and a combination of work and rest, so as to allow tourists to cultivate their temperament and make their body and mind pleasant. For example, the tour guide in the Lingering Garden, one of the Suzhou gardens, has paid attention to using the method of combining motion and stillness to conduct the tour guide of garden art. After passing through the doorway of To Remain Forever in the World, we see that there are 6 leaking windows on the whitewashed wall ahead. The leaking window is commonly known as the figured windows. While being convenient for ventilation and lighting, it allows the scenery outside the window to come through faintly and indistinctly. Therefore, in the garden construction, the figured windows are frequently employed for the functions of through scenery or leaking through scenery. Here, the 6 figured windows partially show the central scenery, enabling people to catch a glimpse of it. In this way, it can simulate the tourist's interest in traveling, making people eager to enter the garden to appreciate the wonderful scenery outside the window. Meanwhile, the garden view passing through the figure windows keeps changing as the tourists move their steps, which is the wonder of changing views as one moves in the appreciation of classical gardens. Explain the characteristics of garden art from the aspects of cultural connotations. Garden art is a special kind of plastic art, which is a 3-dimensional painting and a silent poem. So, tour guides need to continuously learn cultural knowledge and enhance their cultural appreciation taste, and explain the construction characteristics of the garden to tourists from the perspective of cultural connotations. In this way, it can not only enrich the cultural knowledge of tourists, but also improve the quality of tour guide services. The tour guide's explanation is an art. A good tour guide, whose explanation should not only have extensive knowledge, but also vary from person to person and also pay attention to the application of explanation methods. For the garden landscape, our tour guides also need to accumulate the basic knowledge of Chinese and foreign gardens and enhance the aesthetic level of gardens. Well, that's all for the content for today. Goodbye.